Thank you all for joining us. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance, and today we're here for our webinar series exploring the impact return trade-offs in underserved communities in the Global South, what seems to be a very relevant conversation for the members and guests. As you know, this builds on some of our prior explorations. We did a webinar a while back with Aner from Candide Group and with Greg from Ceniarth, looking overall at this issue, not in the old way of the trade-offs, but really, do you have to be concessionary? But trying to dig a little bit deeper on what it means when it is that it would make sense to be concessionary or not, and how it is that some of the investors within this community are looking at that issue. Aner and Greg have thought about this a lot more than I have. You will see in a moment links to some of their writings as well as Mara Bollis's writings on this. So I will leave it to them to take it away. And meanwhile, I just want to welcome everyone and welcome our presenters for today. Again, it's Aner Ben-Ami from Candide Group, Greg Neichin from Ceniarth, and discussing their work will be Brian Heath from Acre Fund and Rick Beckett from Global Partnerships. So Aner, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, as Andrea mentioned, we have a couple of exceptional organizations today presenting with Global Partnerships and Acre Fund, organizations that are doing sort of deep impact work in marginalized communities and doing it at scale. And so these are two organizations that we at Candide have supported on behalf of our clients. So I'll keep the framing part really nice and short here. So primarily to start by saying that as Andrea mentioned, I almost feel like framing the conversation around impact and return trade-offs, we kind of owe you a bit of an apology for doing so, because obviously this is a debate that's been done again and again, and probably one of the more tired conversations in the impact space. On the one hand are those who are all about proving that impact should not be a drag on returns and may actually generate excess returns. On the other are those who say that, well, that might be true for some investments, but it's an approach that leaves out a big part of the universe we need to be investing in. And as Andrea mentioned, if you follow some of our previous webinars or some of the blog posts we've published over the years, it'll come as no surprise to you that we've generally critiqued the doing good by doing well narrative, and the gist of that critique was that if you want to address poverty and truly marginalized communities, and if you want to design really kind of deep systemic change solutions, then you can't, or you probably shouldn't expect to earn very strong returns on all those strategies. There's a couple of links to these blog posts here if you're not already familiar with them, but I'll move on. For the conversation today, we hope to tackle this debate from a sort of specific angle to put a slightly kind of finer point on that debate. So in the context of organizations like Acre Fund, like Global Partnerships, what we're trying to do is to explore the specific cost from an impact perspective, the specific cost that might be imposed by having to deliver certain financial returns to investors in the context of these strategies. So we presented Brian from Acre Fund and Rick from Global Partnership with sort of a what if question. What if you had access to lower cost of capital? What would it allow you to do that you might not be able to do today? So we're essentially saying, it may be possible to do good by to do well by doing good, but that doesn't necessarily mean we couldn't be doing more good if we did a little bit less well, right? And if we try to make those trade-offs more concrete, more quantifiable, would it affect our decisions as investors, how we think about these investments? So, if, for example, we knew that by earning I don't know, 200 basis points less on our capital, we're able to bring solar to truly low-income customers or marginalized communities rather than middle-class ones, or maybe we're able to reach 20% more customers. Really trying to tease that out without change kind of our calculus as investors. So in general, when we look at the universe of opportunities, of impact opportunities, we try to broadly distinguish between two types of strategies. There are those where there's an opportunity that the market has been overlooking or ignoring or maybe slow to react to, but maybe it's the market is sort of wrong or slow, right? There's essentially an arbitrage opportunity for us as impact investors to address a need that the market is not addressing. But there's also a whole bunch of opportunities that in strategies where the market is not wrong, right? I mean, where the market isn't serving a certain community or a certain need because it really is harder or more expensive to do it, right? And I think there is just really recognizing that there are strategies that fall under both those categories. There are plenty of opportunities, we think, that are where the market is maybe wrong or mispricing risk, and there is maybe sort of an arbitrage of sorts for impact investors. For instance, we've recently invested in a media company that represents voices of and for people of color in the U.S., or a company like Maven that creates new income opportunities for black hairstylists in the U.S., right? You could argue there are instances where we get to have impact as well as capitalize on the fact that the market has been too slow or in some cases too racist to see an emerging voice and power and creativity in these communities. You could say the same thing for some of the new clean energy deployment opportunities. There are big companies like Generate Capital that are identifying sort of new technologies that are ready for deployment, and the market is just like efficient lighting or like storage, and the market might just be kind of slow to price those risks appropriately, and we as impact investors kind of get to have our cake and eat it too, so to speak. And there's, of course, there's a lot of research around sort of the accretive value of just good corporate social practices, right? Attracting better and stronger talent to your company by adopting better social practices. So there are a lot of investment theses that are overlapping with impact thesis. But there are also plenty of opportunities where again the market is being quite rational and that serving certain customers is just not a very profitable proposition, or it's just really hard, and that's the universe where our presenters today are operating in. So I think those two categories may get sometimes conflated, and it really is an opportunity for us, or there's a need for us to separate that nomenclature or create new nomenclature that teases those categories apart very clearly. They're always going to be trying to kind of disassociate themselves from each other, right? Because the folks on the former category that are trying to generate strong returns want to distance themselves from the notion of trade-offs that makes it hard for them to raise capital, and while the folks that are addressing structural market failures in a way that makes it really hard to generate a strong return, like Acre Fund or like global partnerships, are always going to endeavor to remind us investors that our financial return has a real impact cost in the field. So we find that to be kind of useful framing. I mean, it's not so much kind of the impact first versus financial first. It's does the impact thesis drive an investment opportunity, or is it a cost, right? So to talk a little bit more about that distinction, and I think a useful kind of nomenclature, we also invite here, or I'll pass the mic on to Greg, and I know they've over at Ceniarth have done some really good thinking around teasing out those categories and making them quite distinct in their strategy. So I'll hand it over to you, Greg, to talk us through that piece.
Great, thanks, Aner. and thanks to everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to have the chance to introduce Brian and Rick. I think that One Acre Fund and Global Partnerships have been not only kind of investees in our portfolio, they have both really helped push our thinking in terms of the evolution of our portfolio at Ceniarth. So, 30 seconds on us. We are a single family office. We manage both a private foundation as well as various unrestricted investment assets. Our focus as an organization, both across all our assets, is to invest in livelihoods in underserved and marginalized communities, with primarily a rural focus. We've been around for about 5 years. We've engaged in probably 50 or 60 transactions across both direct lending to fund investing across a broad range of geographies. We've evaluated probably hundreds of enterprises and funds to get to that portfolio. So the sort of framework that we sort of have today is really comes out of that work and really comes out of a lot of experimentation and learning from doing. And I think that that learning from doing has really led us to a place where our view echoes some of the things that Aner said in his introduction, which is that there are trade-offs between serving the lower income, most marginalized communities that we want to serve in responsible ways and earning comparable returns that one would earn from serving higher income communities. And as Aner alluded to, while this has become a provocative thing to say in sort of the impact investing world, where everyone wants to kind of get along and be in a big tent, it's not a provocative thing to say in the business world, where customer segmentation is a totally normal thing to do, to say, hey, some customer segments are going to be most profitable, capital will flow to those most efficiently. Some segments one might not serve because they're just going to be harder to reach and less profitable. And in our case, because those are the populations that are our mission, we're going to serve, we aim to serve those segments regardless of their profitability. And I think that what we've found in that work is that what we are not really sacrificing is a view on risk. And if you look at how we lay out our strategies in the slide that we have up here, we don't really, there's not an axis up here that is a return axis. The way that we sort of differentiate the three strategies that we run internally is really on risk and then intention. So we differentiate on, is this a portion of our portfolio where fundamentally we are looking at it through the lens of an investor? We're building a sort of a conventional portfolio and then layering on as much impact as we can? Or is our brain focused on, there are particular things in the world that we want to solve, breaking down those value chains, supply chains, what have you, figuring out what those solutions are, and then attacking those with interventions, kind of, understanding that different interventions will have different sort of returns and risks. And so that really drives our framework. So there are essentially in our office three strategies, and you can go to the next slide. We really started with two of these, the two on the ends. We started with a view toward, there's a whole bunch of programmatic work we want to do that's kind of, deep impact. It's going to be high risk, directly aligned with the communities that we want to serve. And a lot of that capital in our early days as an office was going out in the form of PRIs, because a lot of these were interventions that were sort of untested pilots. And then in the meantime, in those early days, we were building out a conventional impact investment portfolio that was weighted across sort of traditional asset classes that had the sort of usual suspect public equity and fixed income managers from sort of the impact investing field, continues to still have private equity managers that are doing really good responsible investing, in the U.S. and the U.K. and Africa and elsewhere, but weren't necessarily reaching the sort of deepest, most marginalized communities that we had hoped to serve. And in doing this work, I think we have recognized that there's really a third way in the middle, that says, hey, we can actually serve the communities that we're targeting. We can do it in a direct way, and we can do it in a pretty sustainable way. It just requires us to have a different view on the return profile that is going to be earned in those segments. It doesn't necessarily require us to have a different view in terms of underwriting risk. We still believe that in this third way, this way that we call impact-led or impact-driven capital preservation, we still believe that we're going to return capital from those investments, but it does mean that we have a much lower bar in terms of the return profile. And that's where we're really headed toward as an office through investing in organizations like Global Partnerships and Acre Fund. Our goal is really to rotate the vast majority of our assets out of the business of sort of basic responsible investing, and into this category that we call impact-led, impact-driven. And I guess I'll say it's not a judgment. I think the people that are doing great responsible investing are doing great work. They're doing work in finance that's better than 98% of other people in finance. So it's not at all a critique of what's happening in that field, and we're glad to see it. We're glad to see it grow. I think our view is just that as we try to serve those most deeply underserved communities and do so in a direct way, we need to find a different, more even more progressive way to deploy our capital. So that's sort of a bit of a story of how we've gotten to where we are today, and how Acre Fund and Global Partnerships fit into our portfolio, and looking forward to hearing them talk a bit more about their work.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Aner, for that. And as I turn it over to Rick, I wanted to highlight a couple of other things that we've been discussing in this area. So first, in terms of those that join us from a more kind of post-philanthropic approach to impact, you've heard us talking about the Buen Fund, where the question is, let's just completely rethink the idea of what these returns would be and the importance that the non-financial returns play on this. And it might be that we look at it from a bit of a semantic or even rhetorical perspective, but just moving away from that idea of the concession on the return, right? If we tie into some of the work that we've done on the wealth inequality, the piece that I think will appear here is that there is a bit of a zero-sum game in terms of who benefits from the investment returns that ties into who has the investment capital in the first place to allocate in that way. And to the extent that there are kind of alpha returns from impact, looking at it from the angle of broader wealth inequality and how is this contributing to ameliorating wealth inequality if what we have is investors ultimately benefiting from the very solutions that they are creating. But with that, I will turn it over to Rick from Global Partnerships. Thank you so much for joining us.
For having me. That's great to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat a little bit with you all. So let me just start, for those of you who are not familiar with Global Partnerships. So we're a fund manager. We're an impact-led investor. Been impact-led fund manager since 2005, and our mission is to expand opportunity for people living in poverty. So our raison d'etre is to empower poor and marginalized people in developing countries to earn a living, provide for the basic needs of their families, and improve their lives. Kind of in a nutshell, Global Partnerships in a nutshell, we have 14 different impact-first or impact-led strategies across all facets of poverty. So not just earning a living, where we have 5 different strategies, but access to basic education, clean energy, decent housing, better health, essential medicines, water, and sanitation. So our understanding of poverty is holistic, and our impact investment strategies kind of reflect that understanding. We've done 7 funds, 4 have fully matured, 3 are active. About 99% of our work is debt, meaning we're making working capital loans available to social enterprises in 17 developing countries that are serving the poor and marginalized people that we exist to serve. We have a small social venture fund that we've just launched, $5 million fund that's aimed at trying to demonstrate that you can do very high impact work by doing seed stage investments and preserve capital. So we've invested almost $300 million over the last 12 years, about 440 investments, meaning individual loans and individual early stage investments. We're in year 13. While historical performance is no guarantee of future performance, we've delivered both principal return plus modest fixed income returns to 100% of our debt fund investors for the last 51 consecutive quarters. And when we think about impact, we have a fairly rigorous quantitative methodology around how many lives are really receiving meaningful opportunity and how much of that is attributable directly to our investments as opposed to other capital providers. So over that time period, our investments have led through our partners to 8.9 million lives impacted. So that's kind of Global Partnerships in a nutshell. I think really to understand our work, I like to begin these kinds of conversations with the reality of poverty as we see it and understand it. When the World Bank talks about $5.50 a day or $3.20 a day in purchasing power parity, that's a little hard to visualize. So, really everything we do starts with the reality faced by the people we serve. And this happens to be a client. Her name is Miriam. At the beginning of her journey in microfinance, which is some of the work we do is involved in microfinance. But really her story isn't my point. The reality of her life is really what I want to bring some attention to. So, when we envision $3.20 a day, Miriam lives in this one-room home with her husband, her parents, and their children. You can see it's a dirt floor. You can ask the question, does the roof leak? They're off the grid like 1.3 billion others. There's no running water. That blue cistern actually in front of her house is where they gather water, and so it's open source, which is associated with all sorts of increased risk of diarrheal disease. They cook in an open fire in that repurposed oil drum on the left. There's no improved sanitation. So, when we think about poverty, we're thinking about not just trying to create the opportunity for people like Miriam to earn a living, but also to address with sustainable solutions as many of these facets of poverty that we can. And our contention is that there's this zone between traditional philanthropy, and there's just not nearly enough of it, and commercial markets, which we're fully supportive of, but tend not to reach this deep and tend not to address all these facets. So there's this band of people and solutions that, to our way of thinking, are not really systematically reached and included, and that's where we want to focus. So when we think about what do we mean by opportunity, what do we mean by impact-led or impact-first? For us, it has 4 dimensions. The first is this notion of broadening opportunities. So what are all the facets of poverty that lend themselves to a sustainable approach? Because if it doesn't cash flow and it's not sustainable, you can't invest in it at all. And can we address as many of those facets of poverty for Miriam and people like her as we can? The second is this notion of deepening inclusion. So we are intentionally trying to operate at the edge of the market where sustainability is possible, but inclusion is limited. So when we think about who is marginalized, that includes certainly how poor people are, but also often includes gender. It can include people who are marginalized by rural geography because the last mile economics are so difficult in rural markets. It can include people marginalized by ethnicity or language. So we envision a suite of sustainable solutions which are deeply inclusive, and we're trying to expand the range, the depth, if you will, where sustainable solutions can operate. The third for us is this notion of scale. We're interested in, if we're going to make a dent in 3 billion people living under $3.20 or almost 6 billion living under $5.50, we need to be thinking about opportunities and solutions that scale. And so we're looking for things that, because of sustainability, can serve millions of people. Some of our early roots as a grant-making foundation were in the world of microfinance, where we spent about a dozen years. And I think, one of the things that there are lots of issues around microfinance, but one of the things that I think is terrific about it is that it demonstrated that if you achieve sustainability, you can scale and serve millions of people, and we took that lesson to heart. And the last dimension for us is improving lives. So every one of our 14 impact-led strategies has a specific thesis, not just about which marginalized people are being served by, but what are the dimensions of impact that we can expect to see? And that varies, that's unique to each of the 14, and I'll talk about 2 or 3 examples here today. But when we think about being impact-led, those are the 4 dimensions. We're trying to make sure that every one of our investments is performing across all 4 of those dimensions. So to this point of, what do we see in terms of the difference? What difference does it really make, is really made between return-led capital and impact-first or impact-led capital? And I think the point that I would make, at least what our experience has taught us, is that economic incentives are incredibly powerful. And that's true not only with return-led equity, it's also true with return-led debt. It's just economic incentives are powerful. And while certain great things can be accomplished with purely commercial markets, there are some limits, and there are some predictable things that those economic incentives do. And essentially it boils down to affecting, in many cases, who gets served, what gets delivered, and then what the resulting impact is. So let me try to bring that to life a little bit by sharing 3 examples so these are 3 of our 14 impact-led investment strategies, and just talk through a little bit what we see in terms of how the incentives associated with different kinds of capital, what it does. So the first example of smallholder farmer inputs with technical assistance. So you're going to hear a lot about this from Brian, because One Acre Fund is a terrific example of an organization doing this. This is one of our 14 investment strategies. So really, you've got hundreds of millions of people, of families, billions of people relying on agriculture, many of them subsistence farmers for their livelihood. What we see in that market is that if you want to serve the poor, the marginalized population there, those tend to be subsistence farmers as opposed to farmers with cash crops. They're less likely to own their land. They tend to not have a lot of assets to secure. If you're going to help them, it really comes down to getting very small amounts of the right kind of inputs, along with technical assistance in terms of how to use those inputs to increase their yields. And then ideally, that combined with some kind of market access, so they have a place, not only they can use some of their crop to feed their family, and they can use the rest of their crop to sell into a local market. The challenge there, if you look at where return-led capital tends to flow in agriculture, it tends to focus on larger farms or larger farmers. It tends to focus on farmers with assets, certainly landowners. It tends to focus on farmers who do not need the technical assistance or education, which is expensive to deliver, necessary to increase yields and increase crop quality. And so the fundamental economics of reaching the poor and more marginalized farmers, as well as the wraparound services, not just the small amounts of credit that they need for inputs, but the wraparound, the expenses of delivering the wraparound services, that just doesn't go hand in hand with profit maximization. You make less money on small farmers, the loans are small, the wraparound services are expensive. And so what we see in this thesis with One Acre Fund and others is that there's a very clear trade-off between the inclusion and the service delivery that we see maximizes yields and decreases hunger with the kind of capital that's being delivered. So that's an example from our 14 strategies of smallholder farmer inputs with TA. We see oftentimes we see the exact same trade-offs, the trade-offs on inclusion and trade-offs on the service design or product design across each of our initiatives. So in the world of microfinance, I'm sure many on this call are familiar with it. The commercialization has done some great things, certainly driven a lot of growth in both access to credit, but also access to other profitable financial services. So that's all to be applauded. There also is a persistent gap in financial inclusion at the lower end. You just don't see the same growth at the lower end. And you see a persistent gap in inclusion of women, which is not only a problem from a pure inclusion point of view, but there's a growing body of evidence in the global development space about the power of getting economic and educational opportunity into the hands of women. It's not just what happens in their lives. What women choose to do with economic resources in terms of providing for their families and the choices they make is a multiplier effect in terms of the impact that's being achieved. So this is an example of what we call women-centered finance with education. Our experience is that if you want to reach poor and marginalized women, this example actually is a group of indigenous women in the highlands of Guatemala who are marginalized not only by depth of poverty, but by gender, by geography, by ethnicity, and by the fact that their first language is indigenous. So the economics of reaching this kind of population with small loans is really difficult. And what we see is that the more commercially oriented capital tends to flow to larger loans and tends to focus on less inclusive loans. And then on the service design side, what we've learned over time is if you really want to be helpful to these women, it starts with financial literacy as opposed to starting with credit. Often the best results are achieved when you combine education, not just financial literacy, but business education and business training for these women so that their productive enterprises are more likely to be successful. And it takes a lot of patience. For the women for whom it works, it takes a period of years to see increases in economic resilience and economic resources in the hands of these women that allow them to better feed their families, send more kids to school, et cetera. So what we see in the area of microfinance, despite its maturity, is that commercial capital tends to focus on the larger loans, that it's not driving the gender inclusion we would like to see, and the profit margins associated with coupling credit with education are lower because if you're using portfolio yield to fund additional services, in this case financial literacy and business education, you just don't see the incentives aligned if we're talking about return-led capital. So the third strategy where we see the same things going on are in the whole clean energy, particularly solar space. There's lots of impact investors are focused on the 1.3 billion people living off the grid, about 1 billion of them being very poor. Typically, the way that that discussion gets framed is around the energy ladder, with the notion that people want to, which they certainly do, and will move up the energy ladder. And what we see is that the profit margin, it's a lot easier to make money on the higher ticket items. It's a lot easier to make money in urban environments with larger home systems or solar solutions that are kind of further up the energy ladder. The economics are tougher if you're talking about pico lights in rural environments for off-grid families who have very little disposable income. But the impact is very high. The kerosene substitution economics are compelling for small solar lights. And the issues around time savings, particularly for women and girls, and safety associated with having light are real. And yet the economic incentives play out the same way in solar that they do that they do in women-centered finance and in smaller farmer work. So what we've come to conclude is that if we're going to see a world with the kind of social impact that we aspire to see, we really need an all of the above approach. We're fully supportive of commercial lending with market-based solutions, with traditional risk-adjusted financial returns, driving the markets to do as many good, impactful, and inclusive things as they can. And we're really focused on this band where the economics are different. The economics of inclusion and the economics of the products and services are different in terms of achieving the outcomes that we want to see for the people that we want to serve. So that's been our experience. And as the other thing that Aner and Greg and Transform asked me to just speak a little bit to is a couple of questions around where do we see impact-led capital emerging, and the investors that we work with, what do we see and what do we see them thinking about? Because we've now worked with impact-led investors, those investors in our funds since 2005. And what we're seeing is that this discussion is broadening a bit, and there are really 4 different segments, if you will, to Greg's earlier point about segmentation, where we see this. We work actively with development financial institutions, and our experience with DFIs is that the bulk of what they do is generally developmental finance, but each of them, or most of them, have recognized through the years of their work that there is this economic trade-off when you're talking about deep inclusion and deep impact. And they either have a separate asset allocation or different kinds of pricing flexibility to be supportive and investing in work where those are the characteristics. The second segment where we see this discussion going and investment going on is with a subset of religious investors. That's particularly true in our experience with Catholic orders, where the social justice tradition runs very deep, and they've been doing this kind of investing for years before the term impact investing was coined, but also university and hospital endowments from their fixed income portfolios. We see this because we're in the fixed income asset class and have the track record that I've described. Our experience is that this is not limited to the PRI activity of foundations, that actually the MRI allocations are relevant as well. That's, I think, in some measure due to the fact that the difference in risk-adjusted financial returns when you're talking about debt are different than when you're talking about equity. But we see a lot of foundations thinking about this, not just in their PRIs, but with their MRIs. And then we work with a lot of high net worth individuals who are and whether that's coming out of a single family office or out of donor advised funds or out of fixed income allocations, out of foundations, what we see is that typically folks who their lived experience is telling them that there's a trade-off on what they care about. And when that becomes true, the thinking evolves. So in terms of what impact-led investors are thinking about, at least what we see in here, we see more and more people, investors, thinking about a continuum of capital rather than thinking about it in dualistic terms. So rather than return-led or all impact, that there is this continuum. You heard Greg describe, Ceniarth's version of it. But we hear that a lot, and the discussion is evolving in our experience to not just to asset allocations across asset classes, be it private equity, real estate, or whatever, but really evolving to think about what is going to be finance first. Is there, in fact, an impact first allocation? Are there recoverable ways of thinking about my philanthropy all the way over to pure philanthropy? And what we're seeing is that continuum is starting to get populated by more and more experiences, and that this segment of the market with this segment of allocation of capital is in its early stages, which is, from my standpoint, exciting because Because as we think about the 3 billion people living under $3.20 and our experience with the economics of reaching them, the larger this market gets, I think the more work we'll be able to do. The final thing I would say on trade-offs is we're now investing in close to 70 partners in 17 countries. And that trade-off that we see our partners making, it's not just about who gets served and what gets delivered, as I've described in those 3 examples. We see partners who actually stop growing at certain rates of capital. And we see that in some of our smallholder farmer work. We've seen that in some of our women-centered finance work in sub-Saharan Africa. They just have a limit in terms of what their economic models are and what their cost of capital can be. That is particularly difficult in markets with volatile FX. So it's related to both what the cost of capital is and the cost of hedging is. But the point is that if you have partners who don't have access to any capital to grow, they're not serving more people, whether that's working capital for inputs for smallholder farmers, or whether it's loans to group lending to very poor women combined with education, and so we're just seeing the social performance slow because the capital market isn't aligned. So let me end with that, and I know that Brian is going to speak next about some of the great work that One Acre Fund is doing, and maybe we can come back to questions or whatever, at that after we're all through.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Rick. I'll hand it over here to Brian in a minute. I think just a quick comment, what I think is really interesting about this conversation, this presentation in the context of global partnerships, is that so much of your work is actually in the very sectors that have seen probably the most commercial capital flowing into emerging markets, right? Microfinance, solar lighting, those are probably the most often sort of mentioned and quoted as the kind of poster children of commercial opportunities and kind of doing well by doing good in those markets. So it's just interesting to see how even in those markets that are viewed as very appealing to investors, by approaching them with kind of a different lens, you are seeing where the trade-offs exist. Rick, I was going to actually kind of maybe turn one question back to you, which was that kind of what if framing. I don't know if you have thought about, and I know you are thinking for your next fund, how it could differ and how you could drive cost of capital potentially further down. And as you do that, what do you see that enabling you doing? I mean, enabling you to do? Are there strategies out there that you kind of wish you could support, or maybe not able to with your current capital structure? What does getting your cost of capital down 100 basis points mean?
Can you hear me? Is my mic on?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I appreciate the question. I think a couple of things. First of all, there are a large number of partners. I think you're alluding to our seventh pet fund, which is kind of on the drawing board. So we have 60 social enterprises that are engaged in a pipeline that are addressing one or more of the 14 different impact-led investment strategies that we have, which need capital and that are capped in terms of what they can afford to. So by dropping the cost of capital by about 200 basis points, which is what we're talking with investors about, there's a pipeline of 60 social enterprises that are waiting to get capital to grow, and are only going to be able to do that in the context of a lower cost of capital. So that's thing one. And of course, why does that matter? It matters because they have the opportunity to not only deepen their service to these marginalized populations that I've described, but grow and serve more people. So I think that really is the crux of it. The second is really more on the upstream side than the downstream side. My sense is that this is a really important segment to begin to open up. And my hope would be that there are a growing number of investors who have some impact first allocation, not just because they can invest through global partnerships, but for the field. And so I think we're trying to design something which and prove that you can deliver deeply inclusive, highly scaled, clear social impact, and that kind of opens up a segment in the capital market. The third thing I would say is that I think there's a fair quid pro quo. If investors are going to provide impact first capital with capital preservation, I think the quid pro quo is there needs to be clarity and better progress in terms of measurement of what do we mean by breadth of, in our case, what do we mean by breadth of opportunity, by inclusion, and is it getting delivered by not just by scale, but customer feedback in terms of the results that they're actually seeing. And so I think we would envision creating a virtuous cycle over the life of that fund in terms of clearer and clearer impact, which it's never going to happen overnight, but we need to keep at it, and we need to keep bringing that clarity back to investors so that they are increasingly confident over time that their allocation is achieving the blended value that they're seeking. So those are some of the things that we're talking about with this seventh fund.
Okay. All right. So yeah, we'll hand it over to Brian now, which kind of working one step downstream from global partnerships. Right? Well, global partnerships works through intermediaries, not directly lending to the household level. One Acre works directly with farmers, so it's sort of an interesting different part of the value chain.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity for everyone to give me the chance to speak about this. This is a really fascinating topic. And I wanted to start by just describing a little bit about One Acre Fund's model, and then looking at some of the trade-offs that we face in terms of the types of capital that we choose to get, as well as the type that's really available to us. And I love to just focus first of all on this picture of Joy, Camba in Kenya. Joy is one of our farmers, and you can see just the look of calm confidence on her face, and she's holding in her hand a hoe that she uses to farm the field that grows the food that feeds her family. And she's just one of a few farmers that One Acre Fund has the privilege of serving throughout the course of our operations in sub-Saharan Africa. So One Acre Fund, I'll tell you a little bit about One Acre Fund to start with. We're a nonprofit organization that serves smallholder farmers. And even though we're a nonprofit 501c3 here in the United States, we really operate much like a business. And we're scaling rapidly. We currently serve about 600,000 farmers. We want to double that over the next 3 or 4 years or so. And it's very important that we double it, because 70% of the world's poor are engaged in a single profession, which is farming. And they are growing food on about an acre of land. As you can see, Oriella and Aner here doing that. And the problem is they're not growing enough food to feed themselves. And so if you travel in East Africa, you'll meet a lot of people. They're very friendly to people coming to see them. And if you talk to them for a while, you'll find out that their middle name is based on the season that they were born in. And many of them have the middle name of Wanjala, which is hunger season, which is a time of meal skipping that occurs after last year's crop has run out. And this year's crop hasn't really grown to the point where you can harvest it yet. And then in Kenya, that actually happens between now, the period about late April through the end of June. But it's different in each country that we work in. And so when you think about One Acre Fund, I think it's important to think about the types of clients that we have. And our general client is shown here. I mean, Anne is very representative of the overall landscape within which we operate. She's a mother of six people, and she's got a husband who works, and together the income that they bring in isn't enough to allow them to buy food 100% of the time year-round. And so they grow food on their own family farm in order to feed themselves and their families. And we're operating, as I said, in sub-Saharan Africa, but we are operating even more so in 6 countries, and one more which we just started, which is Zambia. And what we do is we essentially have a 4-component model that we put together that involves financing, distribution, training, and market facilitation, which is really the process of getting goods and selling it to Sub-Saharan Africa, and then training them and how to use it. So I'll go through each step of the model so you can understand it a little bit better. So financing is a very important element of what we do. Farmers pay a small deposit to purchase goods, and then we take their order and we are accumulating their orders into large sizes, and we're buying in bulk. And we're selling it to farmers during that time of hunger that I referred to earlier, and we're selling it to them on credit. And that's important because at the time when they need the goods the most, because you have to plant at a specific time in sub-Saharan Africa, they don't have the money or the access to those types of products that they need to grow successful amounts of food. And the second element of our model involves distribution. And this is a map of Rwanda, and you can see that the gold stars represent market access points before Acre Fund came along. And most farmers lived, say, within about 30 kilometers of that area. And so, you know, if you had to carry a 50-kilogram bag of fertilizer 30 kilometers, I mean, we all know that would be incredibly difficult to do. And when you take that into the mountain roads of Rwanda, it becomes exceedingly difficult, right? So our value add is that we actually developed all these different market points where farmers can come into us and pick up the goods that we sell them. And those market points are represented on the map by these push pins that we've shown you. And so each farmer now lives within probably about a quarter mile of the push point. And so they're not traveling very far to get the high quality seed and fertilizer that we sell them. When we buy in bulk, we actually ship it to our warehouses first. And this is a picture of one of our warehouses in Kenya. And you can see on the sides, it's got fertilizer stacked up along the side and seeds in the middle of it. And what we do is once we get into the warehouses, we're then going to deliver it by hand to the farmers. So we're going to load it on trucks. You see people taking it off the trucks here and carrying it out to distribution access points. And we're going to do that on thousands of sites during the growing season, so that farmers don't have to go very far to get this stuff. And input delivery is a very happy time, I think, for farmers. And that Francois, you see the smile on her face here is representative of that, because she knows that this is a chance for her to start new growth and to start to develop the food seedlings that will feed her family in a few months. So, Rick commented a little bit on the training element, and this is core to what we do. Many farmers are not using modern agronomic practices to plant their seed and fertilizer, and so and use their fertilizer. And so, training on how to use the products properly and how to use them in minute doses so that they add the most value is incredibly important. And so, this is a picture of Carlene. And Carlene's actually showing somebody how far to place the plant stalks apart in a field to get maximum access to sunlight, maximum access to nutrients, and allow it to grow to its fullest potential. And we're repeating trainings like this all throughout the growing season. They cover everything from how to repay the loan, to good agronomic practices, to our last set of trainings involves crop storage. And that's important because, imagine you're a farmer and you've purchased goods from Acre Fund, and you've had a very successful harvest, but at the time when you come to market with your food, everybody else is coming to market as well. And, simple economics apply in these areas of the world as well, such that if supply is very, very high, price is going to be very, very low. And so crop storage training is one of our most valuable things that we add, because what it allows a farmer to do is to store their crops so that they can eat it later on or sell it later on at a higher price when there isn't quite so much supply on the market. And this is based really in scientific principles about how much moisture needs to be in the crop that's stored, and we use in certain products that we sell enable a farmer to store their harvest in a special bag so the bugs and weevils and mold doesn't get in. I mentioned at the start that we sell our goods on credit, and this is very important because, as I said, the farmers don't have the money initially to pay us back, but they have to pay us back 100% by the end of the growing season. And year in and year out, we're collecting about 98% of the repayments that the farmers, the credit that we afford to farmers. And this is, a 2% loss rate would be enviable in any banking sector that's serving the lowest common denominator in the market, and we've been able to reproduce that for pretty much since inception. And in the years where as we all know, agriculture is not a stable profession. So in the years where the weather doesn't cooperate or anything like, or a drought happens or a pest comes in, we actually have crop insurance to protect the farmer, so that in the event they don't repay, the insurer will actually repay us if there's been a weather event. So that's our approach. It echoes a lot of the things that I think you heard from Rick. It's a combination of selling goods and providing financing, but also providing significant amounts of training. And in our opinion, just to echo Rick's comment, everything has to be provided together, because if you don't offer the products close to farmers' doors, they're just not going to go get them. If you don't offer training, it's not a way to maximize the usage of the product, and if you don't show farmers the economics and the practices of drying, then I think it doesn't allow them to achieve the greatest impact from the work that we're doing. And so we've intentionally built a model that relies on both revenues and grants. I mean, we're a nonprofit organization, and so grants are very, very important to us. And farm revenues cover about 70% of the cost of the core program, but grants cover the remainder, all that's training charges training costs that I mentioned earlier. But then grants also cover a lot of other stuff as well that we do as a nonprofit organization. We're partnering with governments in many countries because that allows us to reach more farmers. That's covered by grants. Grants also cover a lot of the R&D effort we have, to work with different seed varieties or to test the soil quality and to figure out what are the best practices of fertilizer that can be used in the areas that we work with farmers. A great example of a grant-funded activity is tree planting. And this is a picture in Western Rwanda, and you can see that the crops are growing in the foreground, and you can see in the back that farmers have cleared a lot of land, as frankly you and I would if we were growing food, right? If we were hungry, we need to grow food, we would cut down some trees to feed ourselves too, I'm sure. But as we all know now, this is harmful to the environment. It's harmful to the soil quality. And so in every package that we sell to farmers, we include either tree seeds in some countries, or in Rwanda, we actually include tree seedlings. So last year in Rwanda, we planted 3 million trees to help restore the soil quality and improve the environment. And overall, across the whole organization, we feel that 8.6 million trees for the quality of the soil and to improve the environment. Impact investors get involved in debt in our organization purpose than the farmer revenues and the grants that I just discussed. Debt is essentially being used to help us manage the timing gap, and our timing gap comes up because we just have a very long cash conversion cycle, right? We have we buy our goods so that we can get them to the farmers probably 3 to 6 months before we actually distribute them to farmers, because we have to have them travel, international sea routes, and then have them shipped over land from Mombasa to the areas where we work. This page shows like the timeline, for example, in Kenya. We're buying the goods in September, we're distributing to farmers in January to March, and farmers are completing their repayment by the end of September. So all in all, that leads to a cash conversion cycle of roughly, about 4 months or so, because farmers are paying us off a little bit at a time during the long growing season. And the work that we do is very impactful. You can see the picture here. I mean, not only is there are more ears of corn after a farmer uses the goods that we sell, but the ears of maize are actually much bigger as well. And we're very much focused on data and measurement. And so we measure our impact in terms of how much income the farmer has as a result of buying our products. And last year we did some studies, and we found that farmers had about a 60% increase in their farm family income as a result of buying the products that we sell, and the money that they earned was invested in the community where they all live. They're paying for school fees, they're starting new businesses, they're paying in some cases for health care, and buying more nutritious food. I mentioned, our scale. We really want to grow from 600,000 farmers today. We think we'll serve 900,000 by the end of the year and over 1.3 million by 2020. And that's possible because we have a repeatable model that we develop. Every field officer we hire sells the same package of goods to farmers in countries, and we have about a 200 farmer to one field officer ratio on average. And since the farmers have on average, 4 to 5 people in the family, we're actually, believe we're helping the farmers grow their way out of poverty, in the tunes of about, each field officer can benefit the lives of about 1,000 people. And, one of the people that gets benefited from that is someone like Conrad. Now, he was a farmer that joined us in 2012. He wasn't growing, he was growing about maybe 5 acres of maize on his land. And in his first year working with us, he nearly doubled that. And in his second year, he nearly tripled that. And that was really good because his family all of a sudden had food that they could eat, and he actually had an extra income. And so when you talk to Conrad, you find out that he actually started a second business on top of his regular business, growing tomatoes with some other people in the neighborhood who were also 1 Acre Fund farmers. And they ended up growing their developing greenhouses, which is what's shown here, and now they're up to about 600 different plants in their greenhouses. And this has been a tremendous second income for him. He's actually started another business now on poultry rearing. And when you talk to Conrad, he says, without 1 Acre Fund being around, I wouldn't have had this extra income to start these businesses, and my family wouldn't be as well fed. And so, this is a model that is, as I said, it's farmer and grant funded, right? And it's important to understand, I think as an impact investor, what are the trade-offs that we see in our operations? Well, one of the questions we often get is, could you get a fertilizer company to subsidize your purchases of fertilizer? And that's actually a difficult thing to do, because if we undercut the markets for fertilizer, then we're not really using a market-driven approach, and we think that that's really, really important. Our donors, on the other hand, are already funding about 30% of the cost of all the training and the other services that we provide, and the farmers themselves don't have a significant amount of extra money to pay. I mean, they're maybe earning $600 a year, maybe a little bit more. And you can't really get more money out of that in that market. For our average transaction size is about $80. Is already a significant percentage of their annual income. We obtain debt from a lot of different sources, and I would say that all of our investors are impact focused. There's differences in rates because different people have different costs of capital. I would describe about maybe 19% of our total portfolio of debt is at the very lowest cost. But in addition to providing, the extreme lowest cost of capital, there's definitely other ways to get involved, right? You can see on the right that our weighted average maturity of our debt portfolio is very, very short. So, offering a longer term debt, that's very valuable for us because it saves us from an efficiency standpoint. We don't have to renew loans every year. Then also it helps us alleviate our overall liquidity risk. Another example would be providing a revolver. We have a lot of term debt, but our cash flows, given the working capital cycle, fluctuate. It's exceedingly difficult for us to find a revolver. So that's another way, when a true revolver that we can use the money only when we need it without a commitment fee. That's another example of where we could do more good if we got the right type of capital in the organization. And so, I guess that leads to kind of the closing comments. Is how much more good could we do if we got the right type of capital at the right rates? And I think that comes down to several things. It's not just the rate that you pay, as I said. It's really understanding how our hybrid social enterprise model works and is designed to be safe for everybody. I mean, we purposely, build this model so that farmers are insulated from the risk by having the ability to pay us back over the course of the entire growing season in amounts, that they can afford over a 6 or 7 month process. We have a diversified revenue model, for example. Our debt is going to fund, very, very good, high quality current assets. Our farmer receivables are insured. Our inventory, when it's in the warehouse, it's insured against peril. So taking the time to really understand that model is helpful. And I think that, every time that you make an impact investment in an organization like One Acre Fund, what you're really doing is serving people. And, just if you think about like let's look at $1 million loan, for example. If you take that $1 million loan, and we're not buying a productive asset with that. What we're doing is we're actually parsing that out to 1,000 farmers or 10,000 farmers, and buying the quality goods that they need to live on and to solve the issue of hunger. And if you think about 4 or 5 people in each family, each investment that you're making is helping enough people to fill a stadium. It's filling Madison Square Garden, for example, and so that type of scale is it's hard to get in many places. But with One Acre Fund and with other impact-led organizations, you can really do that. And I think that every interest point that we save, every 100 basis points that we save on our interest cost allows us to reach more people as well. So it's a multifaceted approach that we have, and we're really excited to partner with anybody who can help us solve the issues that we face. So let me pause there and turn it back over to Aner to lead the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Awesome, Brian. What's really interesting about this, I think, is how, going back to the point Greg made at the beginning, which is that, you may be giving up return with some of these strategies, but you don't necessarily, you're not necessarily taking on more risk. And what's more, I think, kind of seeing your strategy at One Acre Fund and global partnerships as well, and the extremely and kind of surprisingly really low delinquency rates. I can't quote off the top of my head, Rick, on your end, but I remember it being extraordinarily low. That part, the low risk or the de-risking part, really does is in lockstep with the impact, right? It is actually driven by what you're doing, your proximity to the markets, the way you the technical assistance, the close work with farmers. So that's interesting, right? So impact might not be driving returns here. There's a cost on the return side, but it is driving lower risk. It is reducing risk. So a quick a couple of questions here that came up, and then I'll open the mic up too. question here for One Acre Fund. One, have you learned from the farmers kind of certain farming practices from some farmers you've worked with that you can then help spread to the rest of the community or to the other farmers? Are there sort of lessons from the field that you're then filtering through the fund to the other farmers? And then also related, kind of what is the cost of capital or the interest rate that the farmers pay? Which gets to sort of the question of so the lower your cost of capital, obviously the lower, you can pass that on to the farmers, but that's one piece. But I wonder if there's also another piece around just enabling you to do other things with those farmers. So current services you're offering. Yeah.
Okay. So I think one of the things to emphasize on the learnings that we have is that we're an incredibly transparent company and organization, really, and we are dedicated to not only taking the things that we learn, but also sharing that knowledge with as many people as possible. And so it's really rare that we have any learnings that are considered organization. You'll see us publish on our website. You'll see us publish impact reports. We try to be as transparent as possible about everything. And one of the things that you find when we go into a new area is that we actually improve the yields on both farmers who work with us and also farmers who are nearby who don't necessarily work with One Acre Fund, because farmers are incredibly smart, and they are very focused on seeing what their neighbors do, and if they see their neighbor doing something different, they might try that approach too. And so what we find over the years is that the tide actually lifts for all farmers as well, and we think that's a good thing because we're trying to solve the problem of hunger around smallholder farmers. So I think the second question you asked is what type of rate are we charging to the farmers? And what we're really doing is since we're not providing a cash loan to the farmers, we're selling goods on credit. We're operating on really more of a gross margin kind of basis, and so our gross margin tends to be about maybe a little bit less than 30%. In some countries, it's a little bit higher. And in some countries, it's a little bit lower because the government will actually set controls on the prices of the goods that we sell. But in all cases, it's a positive gross margin. And, it tends to be, that 28 to 30% has tended to be relatively sticky. I mean, I think it was a little bit higher a few years ago before some of the government price controls set in. But over the past couple of years, it's been fairly steady at about 28%.
A question here from Leonardo. So, is there some scale at which you see is there a scale that you get to where these farmers might start to be able to pay what is sort of a market rate? And I don't know, Leonardo, feel free to chime in. Do you mean that One Acre Fund becomes sustainable without grants at that scale, or that the farmers or that the underlying loans will become kind of market rate loans? So both, I guess. So at what scale does One Acre Fund not rely on grants, and is there a scale at which this work does become more sort of commercially bankable, right? The farmers can just take on kind of normal market loans.
So maybe while you're waiting for clarification from Leonardo, I could just start describing the answer to that, because it's a very difficult and complex one. We're operating in I think what I would describe as maybe 3 tiers of countries. At the lowest tier, you've got farmers that are extremely poor, and our transaction size in those countries might be as little as an average of $25. it'll be very difficult for those farmers to ever be able to pay, purchase the fertilizer and seed in such quality and quantity that would allow them to, pay essentially a rate that allows us to be sustainable. In other countries, however, we're close to sustainability, and we're getting closer each year. So the amount required per farmer of subsidy from a grant is actually going down, and that's a function really of two things. One is the farmers are able to use slightly more of their income to buy high quality inputs, and the second thing is they operate on larger quantities of land. And that enables them to buy in larger, and both those things enable them to buy in larger amounts. And so those countries that are on the, have the larger land sizes and the slightly less poor farmers, they have an opportunity, I think, to become sustainable, as you might define it, over time. I think One Acre Fund will always need grants, and part of that's intentional, because we know that you have to provide these other services that Rick mentioned as well in order to get the model to work properly. And so I think that it's not a question of grants really going away. It's allowing grants to be transformed such that they can provide even more benefit than they provide today.
One other comment. This is Greg here. That I just make is, I feel like we as a sector all too often sort of fall into the habit of sort of trying to trace that path, that the sort of sustainable path in the long run will always be, how do these interventions, progress to a point where they can absorb commercial capital. And I think that we really need to push ourselves to sort of abandon that construct, that sort of proving out that these models can have the impacts that they intend to have and can do so in a sustainable way. I think that the long-term, the long-term sources of kind of scalable capital don't need to be commercial capital. There are massive sort of development budgets, philanthropic budgets that are in search of the most efficient way to deliver these impacts to these communities. And so I think that there are other pools of capital, and I think also that we as a family office hope to push other offices like ours to sort of seeing that this impact can be scaled, and even if it doesn't mean generating large commercial returns over time. My boss, the founder of Ceniarth, Diane Eisenberg, always likes to say, if you're rich and all you do is get your money back, you're still rich. So I think that trying to think about returns in that context is important.
Thanks. Yeah, I had one other question, which I think will be maybe the last one here, which I think kind of gets to the core of what this discussion, which is a question around if investors do provide a capital at a lower cost, how do they sort of ensure that what you're doing is driving deeper into impact, versus kind of capturing more of a spread, kind of yourself. And maybe I'll turn this one to Rick, because you kind of alluded to this earlier, Rick, which is it's you call it a quid pro quo, right? I mean, you need to be able to then go back and articulate, well, here are these 60 social enterprises that have now joined our pipeline, which were not in our pipeline earlier because we couldn't support them with our higher cost of capital, right? Or be able to do what we're trying to do here today, which is really point to that, what that lower cost of capital enables you to do.
And in our case, because we think about impact on the 4 dimensions that I described, we welcome the due diligence and the transparency around those. So, for us, just because of the strategy that we've chosen, that would mean what are we doing about broadening opportunity, and how do we both prove that it's sustainable and measure it? What are we doing about inclusion? How are we thinking about that? How do we know it's working? What scale is being delivered? Why do we believe that's attributable to the investments that we're making? And not only what is the intention about deeper impact of the outcomes, but over time, what is the feedback we're getting that suggests that we're on track? And Brian just gave a great example in terms of what Acre Fund does. So from my perspective, I think the conversation that needs to happen between, whether it's between a fund investor in one of our funds and us, or frankly, if it were between us and one Acre Fund, in our portfolio, I think the conversation is the same. Let's talk about the nature of the opportunity. Let's talk about the nature of the inclusion. Let's talk about the scale, and let's talk about why it is lives are getting better. And so I think that, to me, that's a more productive discussion than trying to trace the dollar through, because money's all fungible. It really is about who's being served and what value is being created, and how do we know? And I think that's part of the obligation of anybody who wants to say that they're impact-led, is to speak to that.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're here at right about a time here. So I want to just take a minute and thank you all. Thank you, Greg, for joining, and thank you most of all to Brian and Rick for joining us and sharing their work. I mean, again, really exceptional top-notch organizations doing such difficult, deep impact work at such scale, and with such a remarkable track record when it comes to the repayment rates and their ability to get capital back in and back out. We have the slide up here with their contact information. Invite anybody who wants to kind of continue the conversation to reach out to us or to them. And thanks again. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Rick, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aner. Thank you, everyone at Transform Finance, for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us, and you will see there the information if you would like to get in touch and learn more about the work of the Investor Network. And thank you, Aner, for leading the conversation today. Very enlightening stuff. Thanks, everyone. Bye.